This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former legislator, former chair of the State Board of Education, and all kinds of other great things, Grand Poobah Phil Kirk, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and Peg O'Connell, who is a lobbyist and a lawyer and all kinds of other great things herself. Well, we've got another compelling show for you this week, beginning with a discussion of the federal judge's ruling affirming voter ID, the governor's proposed budget, and an update on politics in North Carolina. And of course, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. After 2 hearings and due deliberation, U.S. District Judge Thomas Schroeder released a 485-page opinion that affirmed that North Carolina's voter ID law is constitutional and should remain in effect. Schroeder said the plaintiffs had failed to demonstrate the law violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act or the 14th, 15th, or 25th Amendments to the Constitution. Peg, press reports made an issue of the fact that Schroeder was appointed to the bench by former President George Bush, implying somehow that this decision may have political overtones. Here's what North Carolinians want to know. Can we be confident this decision was reached because of the rule of law, or was politics involved?
Well, Tom, I think Judge Schroeder is a very good and respected judge. I don't think that this decision was political, but I do think it will have great political ramifications for how our elections are conducted in North Carolina. The judge was pretty clear that the state had a legitimate interest in crafting what I think is an unfair and bad voter registration and ID process, but he said it was within their power to do so. They had a legitimate interest, and the plaintiffs in the case did not meet the burden of proof of proving that they were doing something nefarious in it. Yeah.
You were going to say something.
I found it interesting, the inconsistency in the media. A lot of times they do refer to who the appointing authority was, and other times they don't. And I've noticed a trend toward reporting that more, which raises questions. But on the voter ID, I've always thought that was constitutional because it's already been proven constitutional in other states. It
wasn't just voter ID that he affirmed. He is going to affirm the provision to disallow out-of-precinct voting, as well as same-day registrations.
Right.
Were you surprised by any of this, John?
No, I think that a fair-minded observer would admit that the plaintiffs always had an uphill climb because they had to prove, I mean, it's always difficult to prove a negative or to work in hypotheticals. Well, voter turnout would have been higher except for, and they had a fundamental problem that the judge actually referred to in the decision, which is that North Carolina did not institute a bunch of policies years ago and then pull them back and be a rare state that lacked all these policies. North Carolina's current policies make it similar to most other states in most respects. So the judge's argument was you have to meet a pretty high bar to justify declaring unconstitutional or illegal policies that most states have. That was the basic problem.
This leads to the question, Chris. The plaintiffs in the case, primarily the NAACP and the ACLU, say they're going to appeal this verdict.
Of course.
But on what grounds? What grounds do they have?
They're going to make the same arguments to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And we've seen federal district court judges overturned by the Fourth Circuit, recently the redistricting case and some others. What I find interesting about this is we haven't talked about the General Assembly when they passed this bill originally said it was fair, it's legal, it'll hold legal muster, and then all of a sudden they panicked a few months ago and said, oops, we made the voter ID provision too hard, and they weakened it knowing that they would lose the case otherwise. So they already know there was a big flaw with the law. Ironically, Senator Richard Byrd's vote would not have counted had they not changed the law, because he was allowed to vote with a provisional ballot because he forgot his voter ID law.
In the primary
election.
Yeah.
So I think this case is far from over. We're going to see it go to the Fourth Circuit, and I have a feeling the Supreme Court eventually is either going to have to decide to hear this case or uphold whatever the Fourth Circuit does.
But they've affirmed voter ID laws in other states, haven't they, Peg?
They have, and I think the one thing that could possibly change the outcome is if the judge was using the legitimate state purpose test, and many judges you really have to get over a giant bar to say that the state doesn't have the power to do things like this. They could say that this is the rights to vote is so important that you need the higher bar, you need the strict scrutiny test. The court could go that way,
But
it's
our
highly
state constitution is pretty clear on this. It mandates requirements for age and residency. And then other than that, it says that the legislature has the prerogative of being able to pass election laws. So I guess if legislatures in the past had loosened those laws, then isn't it conceivable legislatures now can tighten them up?
It's conceivable to me, but you know, that's why we have lawsuits, and that's
Keep
why
in
things
mind,
go to court too.
We're talking about a federal case, so the state constitution's requirements were relevant to the state litigation. In the federal case, they have to make as you say, a 14th Amendment claim or 15th
Amendment.
Or amendment involving young people regarding the pre-registration thing. And again, this is not, you can think that North Carolina's election laws are bad. You can think that we should have had
some of us do.
I understand, but you could think the early voting period should be longer. You should think same-day registration is a good idea. You could think all of those things. The problem is you have to not prove that they're a bad idea, you have to prove they're completely unconstitutional, and that's a pretty high bar that I thought the plaintiffs were never going to reach.
So, Chris, is this going to affect our June 7th elections or the November 8th elections? Are they going to go through with this new law?
Yeah, they will go through, and then we'll see what happens when the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals takes this up, and eventually, as I mentioned, I think the Supreme Court will have to decide whether they want to hear it or not. So it's far away from over.
But the plaintiffs said, you know, in making their case originally, that it was going to hold down particularly minority voting, and yet in last March's primary, we had almost a record turnout.
Well, that's what I assume the court will look at that as to what the turnout was before the law and what the turnout's been since.
But that's what's so difficult, as John mentioned. You can't, some elections, depending on who's on the ballot, what's going on that day in the weather. I mean, there's a million things that affect the turnout. That's what's so difficult to say what's cause and effect.
But that's the point. There have been some efforts to do that in looking at multiple states, modeling election turnout in multiple years, and the empirical evidence does not support in most cases that it has an effect on turnout. Same-day voter registration is a counterexample, but in most of these cases there does not appear to be much of a statistically significant effect on turnout, which is not very helpful to the plaintiff.
All right. Well, we thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Be sure to get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or, as I've recently learned, on Twitter, @NCSpinTweets. After we come back from these messages, we're going to talk about the governor's budget proposals.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
North Carolina is a great state with great assets.
Among them are 180,000 state employees.
Our legislators are considering important decisions regarding working conditions,
health insurance,
retirement benefits,
and pay for state employees.
Scenic is the one voice at the table when those decisions are being considered.
Scenic is revitalized and refocused.
A stronger Scenic ensures a more effective voice.
Learn more at www.scenic.org.
We now return to NC Spin.
Our legislature came back to Raleigh last week for the so-called short session, and as is customary, the sitting governor makes recommendations for the legislature to consider in passing a budget or revising a budget. Governor McCrory's recommendations included a 2.8% increase of spending, which would bring state spending to $22.3 billion. We want our panel to discuss the specifics of that. Phil, when the legislature opened last week, there were literally thousands of people demonstrating about HB 2. 50 were arrested that Monday evening. You've served in the legislature. Are these demonstrations on both sides of HB 2 just preaching to their respective constituencies, or do you think they're going to have any effect on the lawmakers? And If so, what?
I think they'll have little or no effect. I think both sides do that to fire up their base. I think what has more impact and will have more impact with the legislature are the increasing number of jobs that are being lost, the increasing number of events that are being canceled, the effect it's having on tourism and sports events, and the future. I think economic facts and losses weigh more heavily on legislators' minds. Not against the demonstrations, but they really fire up the bases of the two groups.
No question. Peg, you've been around watching budgets for some time. The governor asked for a 2.8% spending increase. Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger says he's thinking more along the lines of 2%. John recently on the show said that there's going to be an anticipated $1 billion of available money that's not committed in the budget. Tell us why the governor's proposal was unrealistic, or why it didn't get a good reception over at the legislature.
Well, I don't know that the governor's proposal was unrealistic, and I know we'll talk about specific pieces and parts, but there have been a lot of programs that have been unfunded or underfunded or completely stripped bare during the tough times, and the governor is working I think he could do more. He could make bigger recommendations, but programs around health and mental health, the infrastructure is crumbling, those kinds of things. I think he was brave to step up. He could have stepped up a little bit more, but I don't think he was being unreasonable at all.
Aside from HB2, John, the issue that seems to be getting a lot of play so far early on is teacher pay.
Yes.
The governor wanted a 5% increase that would increase teacher pay to an average of $50,000. Speaker Moore and Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger said they didn't think that was possible. What do you think they would approve?
Something in the same direction, but not quite as far the first year. Maybe they'd get to Governor McCrory's average of $50,000 the second year. I think there'll be a substantial teacher pay raise. It's important to note that the governor's proposal is not 5% across the board. It's an average of 5%.
Yes. Again,
there'd be under the model that I think they're putting out, early career teachers would still get a larger percentage raise of the base pay, but then the more experienced teachers get a larger amount of the bonuses. I think that one thing we'll see in the legislature is some attempt to balance the teacher pay, the teacher compensation increase and state employees' compensation increase, because under the governor
and retirees.
Under the governor they had a bonus, but many of them would not get an increase in their base pay. Some would. There are some monies for law enforcement getting a base pay and some changes in particular job categories. I think he'll end up with a somewhat smaller teacher pay increase and something more like a base pay increase, even a small one for state employees.
Chris, last week WRAL Television in Raleigh did a damning documentary about teacher pay, and they said that after inflation-adjusted dollars, teachers in North Carolina are making 13% less today than they were back when we were 19th in the nation. We're now some $12,000 a year below the national average. Lawmakers have been paying lip service to the fact they want to bump up teacher pay, but they haven't done a whole lot. How do they expect to retain teachers if they're not going to pay them?
That's a good idea. I mean, a good question. I don't know. And I think that what's fascinating about this is that the justification sort of was, well, the Democrats were the ones who really cut it, ignoring for the most part the Great Recession that
Nelson
happened.
Dollar said that on the documentary.
Right. And then, but a lot of states did that. And then what happened after the recession is a lot of states came back and started reinvesting a lot of monies in education. We've chosen to cut taxes significantly, even in an era where 2 years ago on the show, I think last year, most people thought they shouldn't cut taxes. They should wait and see what the 2013 tax cuts brought us. They cut taxes again. The Senate wants to cut taxes yet again. I think the governor's not doing enough on teacher pay. I think all teachers have deserve some significant increase. And it's really unbelievable that we're sitting here bragging about how wonderful the economy's doing, the Carolina comeback, everything is going swimmingly in North Carolina, and we can't give our state workers a pay increase in the governor's budget. They have not had a significant pay increase in years, and I actually think the bonus is almost an insult, and the budget makes it clear this is doesn't go toward their retirement, so next year their salary goes back to what it was.
And they keep giving these ridiculous one-time bonuses to state employees. Could
I disagree with
yes,
the statement that the Republicans haven't done much on teacher pay? They've raised teacher pay or teacher compensation over $1 billion in the last 2 years. This year, the governor's budget has almost $400 million new dollars in teacher pay. So
we're 42nd in the country, and we used to be 19th.
We were 47th when the Republicans took over, and we moved up 5 spots last time.
Okay.
We were 47th when they took over, Phil. We got 47th while they were there. That was 2 years ago.
The second year.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct. That's
All right.
correct.
Back to the governor's budget pay. You mentioned the fact of the infrastructure and so forth like that. The governor wants to put about half of this $1 billion surplus into the rainy day fund and repairs and renovations. Now, some people believe we've already stuck a pretty good sizable chunk of money into reserves in the event of another recession, and now's the time to catch up on some of these pent-up demands. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think it's good to have some money to fall back on because we can see how devastating an economic downturn can be. But, you know, the state government and our state budget is an economic engine, drives our economy in and of itself. So, and, you know, if you go into state buildings, things are falling out of the ceiling on your head. I mean, some of the places, if you go to where the folks over at DHHS are, it can be dangerous to go to work simply because the infrastructure is falling to pieces.
So, John, in past years, when the governor has presented a budget to the legislature, it was pretty much dead on arrival. Is that going to be the case this year, or do you think they might give some more consideration, particularly since this is a re-election time?
Well, I'll gently push back on your argument because governors always get almost everything they propose in budgets. Okay, the disputes are they're on the margins. Okay, so the budget that the governor prepares and puts forward is the vast majority of that is what happens. So there's a debate about the 5%, 10% wiggle. So what happens here, I think, is that they will put substantial amount into savings, and I think it's a good idea. We need the governor's proposal is another $300 million into rainy day, another $150 million into Medicaid reserve, and $155 into repair and renovation. But I'm not going to treat that as savings. If you take rainy day, because that'll be spent on the building needs, you take rainy day and Medicaid reserves, that's now going to be about 8% of the general fund budget. That is what we essentially require local governments to keep in reserve. The state should absolutely have 8% at least in reserve.
All right, Phil, final question. You're chief of staff for governor. How hard should McCrory push the legislature on this budget?
Well, he needs to push hard, and I think he's continued to push harder each year as he's grown in the job. And I want, for the record, to agree with Chris on something. I think it's deplorable that there's not a raise in there for state employees. They have not received any kind of raise for many, many years. So let the record show that Chris and I agree on something.
That's a rarity, as a matter of fact. After these messages, we're going to take on the update on elections.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Closed. A sign you're seeing too often, especially on abandoned grocery stores and markets. When these stores close, we all lose. We lose the healthy North Carolina grown fresh produce, and our farmers lose local outlets to sell what they grow. The Healthy Corner Store Initiative can change this by providing resources to local small store owners so they can stock and sell fresh fruits and vegetables. Find out how you can get involved at ncallianceforhealth.org.
Now to North Carolina. We've seen a major climate change with Pat McCrory as governor. North Carolina is at the top of business climate rankings in the best business journals and moved from 44th to 15th best state for business tax climate with the Tax Foundation. With 260,000 new jobs created, it's a sunny day in North Carolina. The forecast is for lower taxes and even more jobs, thanks to Pat McCrory, who gave middle-class families the biggest tax cut in state history.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
As the presidential nominating process moves toward resolution, we want to talk to the panel about the current political climate, which parties stand to benefit, and how this is going to impact candidates on the ballot. Chris, between the political circus that's been taking place nationally, especially in the Republican Party, and HB 2, Democrats believe the winds are shifting in their favor. Is this perception a reality? And if so, how's it going to affect November's elections?
Well, I do think it's a reality, but remember, it's May. Basically, we have a long way to go. Things could change back and forth 5 times before the general election in November. But I do think the controversy about HB 2, while it has energized some of the Republican base, I think it's energized a whole new group of people on the progressive or liberal side of the spectrum. And you combine that with the chaos in the Republican primary and the likelihood that Donald Trump will be the Republican presidential nominee. I think the Democrats have reasons to be optimistic, but again, we've seen things change in politics dramatically, and between May and November is an eternity. So I wouldn't, if I was a Democrat and saw the polls that showed they're doing well, I certainly wouldn't bank on that happening.
Phil, you've been involved in elections, both from a campaign as a candidate as well as helping candidates. We've said on this show that whoever wins the Democratic and Republican nominations are going to have a big impact on North Carolina's elections. Do you still think that's the case?
I think the so-called coattail effect is diminished over time.
You do?
But I think it does affect turnout. But I think there's more independent voting among even registered Democrats and registered Republicans. But if it's a really disaster, it can really lower your voter turnout.
All right, so walk us through this, John. If Donald Trump prevails for Republicans, what do you think is going to happen? If Hillary Clinton prevails and gets a nomination for Democrats, how do you think it's going to affect us?
Well, if Donald Trump is nominated, I won't be around to watch it because I assume the rapture will occur at that point and I will disappear.
I'm going to make a note of that.
But look, for decades, Democrats in North Carolina had for state offices had a shackle around their ankle.
Right.
And it was the Democratic presidential race. Often, not always, but often the Democratic nominee, at least in North Carolina, was going to get shellacked for president. And Democratic candidates for governor and Senate and legislature and Congress and so forth would stay away from the Democratic presidential nominee and sometimes survive the resulting carnage. This is where the Republicans may be going now, where if Trump is the nominee, they're going to have to dodge and weave. And I'm focusing on my race, and North Carolina's problems are what I'm concerned about. And
won't appear with him.
If the Republican nominee shows up in eastern North Carolina, they'll be in Silva.
All right, Peg. The latest polls are showing that Richard Burr is leading the U.S. Senate race, but a recent PPP poll showed that gap has narrowed down to 4 points. Is this because you think people support Burr, or they don't know Deborah Ross, or what do you think is the reason behind his incumbency making a difference?
Well, you know, incumbency always makes a difference, whatever race you're running in. So that's good for a number of points. But, you know, when Deborah got the nomination and announced her candidacy, she wouldn't get in this if she didn't think she could win. And there is probably not a stronger candidate coming along.
Phil, on the other side of that, the latest polls show Roy Cooper is ahead of incumbent Governor Pat McCrory. What's your expectation about how is that going to narrow?
Like Chris alluded to earlier, that's going to go back and forth as different events occur, and it's going to be a close. People said all along it's going to be a close race, and a lot of money coming in for both sides.
Well, after this break, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely. Building on North Carolina's medical home model, better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
Now to North Carolina. We've seen a major climate change with Pat McCrory as governor. North Carolina is at the top of business climate rankings in the best business journals and moved from 44th to 15th best state for business tax climate with the Tax Foundation. With 260,000 new jobs created, it's a sunny day in North Carolina. The forecast is for lower taxes and even more jobs, thanks to Pat McCrory, who gave middle-class families the biggest tax cut in state history.
Along with you, I always enjoy this next part of the show when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know, because I don't know what they're going to tell me I don't know. Peg O'Connell, I'll start with you.
Well, a sad piece of information, 36% of North Carolina children and adolescents are overweight or obese, and that is creating an epidemic that we will pay the cost for in the future.
Wow. Is that a higher number than what it's been?
It's one of the highest in the country, and it's getting worse every year.
Wow. John, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, we should pay close attention to the state treasurer's race, open seat in North Carolina for the first time in a while. We mentioned, I think, on a previous show that Dale Falwell, the Republican nominee, received the endorsement of the State Employees Association of North Carolina. That was somewhat of a surprise. I think you should be on the lookout for additional endorsements of the Falwell campaign in the next few weeks. It's going to be a very spirited race between him and, of course, our former NC Spin panel colleague, Dan Blue.
All right. Tell us something we don't know, Chris.
Well, the session just started, but there's already a bill I think that is really not in the best interest of North Carolina. It's a revenue bill that's a decoupling of the IRC revenue code. That happens every year. They decide how much they want to follow. This year, what they've done in the Senate bill, if people get mortgage relief, they're about to lose their home, the state of North Carolina will tax the amount their mortgage goes down. So you're about to lose your house. You get a little bit of a relief from your bank or a federal agency. Now the state of North Carolina wants to tax that. What's next? We're going to tax people's meals at the soup kitchen?
We call that piling on, don't we?
Well, I think we do.
Phil, tell us something we don't know.
In today's times when most civic clubs are losing members, the Kiwanis Club of Raleigh is an exception. They're now the 5th largest Kiwanis Club in the world. With 250 members, they're the largest Kiwanis Club in North and South Carolina, and they're attracting more women, minorities, and young people, and the average age has gone from 64 to 62.
And that's because they have you as such a great participant. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.